Hello and welcome back to my channel. It might not be fall yet, but where I live, temperatures are dropping. So you know what that means. It's time to make a fall jacket. I really like this Zara jacket. Every time I see a workwear utility style jacket like this, I think of fall. So I've been wanting one for my fall seasons for a while now. I really like the contrasting colors too. This Zara one is pretty affordable, but I want it in a different color, and I want my jacket to have pockets at the sides because I like to put my hands in my pockets when I'm wearing my jackets, and just having the cargo pockets, it's kind of awkward to put your hands in those. Even if it was designed that way, I'd still probably want to DIY it because that's the fun part, trying to recreate something I like. I love the cut of this jacket. I love the two big cargo pockets. I also think the welt pocket is cute, but like I said, I want those side pockets. So instead of putting the welt pocket up there, I'm going to double it and put a welt pocket on either side of my cargo pockets. For my pattern, I actually went yesterday and traced this jacket that I'm wearing right now. The fit is perfect because I like to be able to wear hoodies underneath my jackets, and with this fit, I'll definitely be able to do that. So I went and laid my jacket on my tracing paper and traced around the front of my jacket. As I always do, used my sewing pin to trace along the curved edges I couldn't directly trace around. Then I marked a line where I'm going to separate the yoke from the rest of the front. I added a 1/4 inch seam allowance to the perimeter and a 2-inch hem allowance. Since I cut this without seam allowance, I wrote in reminders to add seam allowance to these edges when cutting it out. I'm going to cut out 2 of the yokes and 4 of the bottom parts. Then I went and folded my jacket in half and traced around the back the same way. I used a sewing pin to mark the yoke onto my paper. Then again, I added a 1/4 inch allowance to the perimeter except to the side to be cut on the fold, and 2-inch hem allowance to the bottom. Then I went and laid out my sleeve and traced that onto my paper. There's a seam on the back of this sleeve that I want to add to my sleeves, so I folded the sleeve over, lining it up with this line, and traced the rest of that part of the sleeve and added seam and hem allowance and cut that out. Then I traced the smaller section of the sleeve separately and added a 1/4 inch seam allowance and 1.5 inch hem allowance to that as well. Last of all, I traced the collar of the jacket onto my paper, which is a 2-part collar. And I went and cut all of that from this green denim fabric I got from Joann's. Okay, now that I have everything cut out, the first thing I'm going to do is add my pockets, starting with the welt pocket. I'm going to put my yoke and extra bottom piece aside, and I cut out this piece of fabric and marked on there the width and height of my welt. I pinned this onto the front bottom, right sides facing where I wanted my welt pocket to be, and stitched it on around the rectangle I drew on there. Then I cut down the center and into the corners and turned this piece to the wrong side and pressed it. Now what's supposed to happen is I'm supposed to fold this fabric up to create the welt of the pockets, but I accidentally sewed this piece on backwards. So if I fold this, it's going to be the wrong side of the fabric facing up, and I don't want that. So what I'm going to do to fix this is I'm going to cut off this excess fabric, cut a rectangle from my fabric. I'm going to fold it in half and press it, and I'm going to sew that in to create my welt. This welt pocket is looking so good. It's getting me so hyped to see this jacket finished. But now that I have my welt pocket in there, I'm going to work on my cargo pocket. Here are the measurements I used for my cargo pocket. I folded this rectangle in half and backstitched along the top and bottom at the under center point of my pleat. Then pressed in my pleat and base stitched it in place. Then I went and searched around the perimeter of all of these pieces and sewed the sides to the rectangle first. I pressed open those seams and folded over the top edge an inch, pressed that in place, and then top stitched. Then I went and sewed on the bottom piece, making sure to not stitch it down at the ends in the seam allowance so that I could pin those short edges to the sides like this. I went and sewed all of that in place, and then with the sides folded to the back, top stitched along the perimeter of the pocket. Now my pocket is almost ready to be sewn on next to the welt pocket, but I still need to go and add a snap button first before I do that, and I need to finish my pocket flap. I thought I was recording the steps it took to get here, but it turns out I wasn't. But all I basically did was sew the two flaps together, right sides facing, and I trimmed off the excess fabric in all the corners and at the point here at the bottom. I'm going to turn this right side out. I'm going to press it, and I'm going to serge across the top edge after top stitching. Top stitching comes after pressing. Then I'm going to serge along the top edge, and then I'm going to add my snap to this flap and to the pocket piece. These are the heavy duty snap buttons I'm using. They are hammer on, and I'm just going to be following the directions on the back of the pack to install them. Now this pocket is ready to be added, so I'm going to go and sew this on next to my welt pocket. I laid my pocket next to the welt and marked where I wanted it to go. Then I folded under the seam allowance and pinned the pocket to the front and stitched this on. And I stitched down the top side and here like this. I sewed my pocket flap on right sides facing, and then turned this down and did 2 rows of top stitching along the top edge. And here is how it's looking. I laid my yoke right sides facing on this and then sandwiched that between the other front bottom, and I stitched all of these together. I turned this right side out, pressed this, and then did 2 rows of top stitching. I also went and base stitched the 2 bottoms together along the sides. See how the back piece became the pocket lining for my welt pocket? I love it. It's so cute. Now with both halves of my front complete, I'm going to go and sew the backs together so that I can start assembling my jacket. I sewed the yoke to the bottom back piece right sides facing along with a strip of bias tape. Then I went and pressed up that seam and folded it into the bias tape, pressed that up toward the neckline, and did 2 rows of top stitching. I sewed the fronts to the back at the shoulders again with the bias tape, and again I folded that seam into the bias tape and pressed it toward the front and again did 2 rows of top stitching. I sewed the 2 parts of my sleeve together the same way. I pinned the sleeve to the armhole, lining up the sleeve seam with the back seam. Then I sewed the sleeve onto my armhole and finished the raw edge with bias tape. I folded that seam toward the neckline and top stitched it in place to get these results. I did not realize that I accidentally top stitched one of my shoulder seams toward the sleeve and not toward the neckline, which is what I intended to do. And many steps go by before I realize this, but if you realize this, I do end up catching this and fixing it later. Now that I got these sleeves sewn on, I'm going to go and close the sides of my jacket. I went and finished the raw edges with my serger, and I also top stitched along the sides of my welt pocket to keep that in place. And now I'm going to go and sew the collar together so I can get that onto my jacket. I went and pressed interface into all of my collar pieces, and I pinned the 2 parts of the collars together. I stitched them together and then pressed the seam upward and top stitched. I sewed the 2 collars together right sides facing, snipped the excess fabric from the corners, and turned it right side out, pressed it, and top stitched it. I pinned the collar to the neckline of my jacket and stitched it on. Now I'm going to go and add the zipper. I base stitched the zipper in place first, right sides facing, and then stitched it on using my zipper foot. Then I folded the zipper in and top stitched. And I sewed the piece of bias tape to the neckline. I folded that raw edge into the bias tape like this and stitched that in place. I ended up changing my collar. I initially wanted a corduroy collar, but my fabric stores did not have the corduroy fabric in the color that I wanted my collar to be. But yesterday I realized that I could go to the thrift store and find a pair of corduroy pants and cut my collar from there, and that's what I ended up doing. It's close to being the same kind of brown, and it works so much better as far as the weight of the fabric. So I don't know why I didn't initially think to do that. I also went and hemmed the sleeves with a double fold hem, and I hemmed the bottom of my jacket. But before I did that, I went and followed the directions on the back of this pack of eyelets, and I installed an eyelet at each end of the inner bottom about 4 inches from the zipper edge. And I did 2 rows of top stitching when stitching the bottom hem in place. I really thought that I could get away without adding a facing to the fronts of my jacket, and I just realized at this point that I really needed to add it in there. Look at this one side with the facing and this side without a facing, and you're supposed to add a facing before you top stitch along the zipper and before the bottom is hemmed. It's just easier to do it that way. I did not want to seam rip the bottom hem or the top stitching along the side of the zipper, so I added my facing without disturbing that. I did have to seam rip off the bias tape along the collar at the ends because the facing would be there, and I just cut a piece of fabric and I added interfacing to it. I stitched it to the collar where I seam ripped that bias tape, and then I folded that down, and I did have to hand stitch it along by the zipper in the bottom edge, and I top stitched it in place with my sewing machine on the other end. I went and folded that bias tape back down again and stitched that back in place. And now I need to sew and add my zipper cover. I cut 2 rectangles 3.5 inches by the length of my zipper plus seam allowance. I pressed interface into each and stitched them together right sides facing and snipped the excess fabric from the corners. I turned this right side out, pressed it and top stitched along the edge, and then serged the raw edge. Then I sewed this to my jacket alongside my zipper right sides facing. I folded it over and did 2 rows of top stitching. I added this brown string into the bottom of my jacket and used tape at the end of the string to get on these cord stops at each end. The last step to finally finish my jacket is to add the snap buttons. I'm going to add 4 snap buttons to the front of my jacket, and I'm going to add a snap button to each of my sleeves, just like it is on the Zara jacket. I added my sleeve snap buttons on the hem instead of over it like the Zara jacket, and that completes my jacket.